my key research question is, where have all the private military contractors gone? Now, that's an odd question, and I'm asking it for the following reason. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan brought about the biggest private military force in recent history. Private military contractors have been engaged in a range of services. For instance, you have a lot of private military contractors who are protecting convoys, protecting high-worth individuals, protecting critical infrastructure. The close protection guys are, for the most part, former soldiers, so they've been trained to respond to situations in certain ways with force, and that's their value on the labour market. So they're purchased by mainly neoliberal states in order to perform those roles. No one really knows how many there are, or there have been in Iraq and Afghanistan. No one's been counting properly, to be honest. But we know that the armed former soldier private military contractors probably number in the tens of thousands. An interesting thing has been happening over the last 5 or 6 years, which is demand for their services has reduced as coalition operations have been downsized. And as a consequence, the number of armed former soldier private military contractors in Iraq and Afghanistan has massively reduced. Now, no one's asked where they've gone, and I find this very strange. I think part of the reason is because a lot of the international relations literature and international law literatures are very much focused on the implications of private military contractors in hostile environments. They want to know what's the significance of having private military contractors on the front line performing soldier type duties, and that's we need to know that is an extremely important line of inquiry. But because they're so focused on hostile environments, they've tended not to ask what happens when they leave the hostile environment, and essentially that's where I'm picking up the narrative. So my question is, where do all the contractors go? Where have they gone? There are tens of thousands of armed private military contractors who are former soldiers, and they're no longer in Iraq and Afghanistan. So where are they? And my research has been following them. No one knows anything about the private military contractors who have left Iraq and Afghanistan. Presumably they've gone home. So my research is trying to trace chronologically where they've gone since they've left hostile environment work and where they are now. I've done this by tracking down UK former private military contractors, almost all of whom fit a particular profile, which is they were soldiers, mostly infantry, and then during maybe 2004, 5, 6, in what was called the dash for cash, when the private military sector exploded, they took up new positions in the private military sector. So I've been asking private military contractors about their life stories. So what's happened since they've left the hostile environment? And my point of reference, or my comparative point of reference, has been what happens to soldiers. Okay, and we know a lot about what happens to soldiers when they return from hostile environments, in part because Ministry of Defence and veterans charity organisations keep quite close tabs on where they are. Often they will go through decompression, they'll have some sort of exit interview, they'll go through various forms of physical and psychological assessments, there'll be resettlement grants, retraining programs, and so on. And the Career Transition Partnership will, for those who have entered into it, will keep track of where they are for a couple of years. In short, we've got the semblance of a narrative about what happens when a soldier leaves the military. But private military contractors, we don't really have any information about their chronology. So what I've been doing is just piecing it together. The one place to start is, how do they leave? What happens when your contract ends? Essentially, the company you work for will fly you home, usually via something like Dubai or Kuwait, and then you'll just land back in a UK airport, a day or so after you've been working in the green zone in Baghdad, and there's nothing in between. It's essentially you end your work like any other subcontractor leaves their line of work, as if you're a bricklayer or working in cosmetics. There's no distinction between the private military contractor, the construction worker, and the cosmetics worker. They're all treated in the same category. Well, instantly, certain alarm bells start ringing, because the reason that militaries undertake a very careful civilian transition of their soldiers is to manage some of the problems that occur when a soldier returns back from a hostile environment. So that's an important line of inquiry. And what I have found is that a number of former private military contractors have come back and they've encountered problems. I know this in part through my interviews and in part as well because they have appeared in the veterans charity sector. Because they're almost all former soldiers, they are eligible for support in most veterans charities. Now, the veterans charities aren't necessarily looking to help private military contractors, but when they turn up, if they meet the eligibility criteria, they will receive help. And you can start to get a sense that there is a clear comparison between the sorts of problems that soldiers encounter when they return back and the sorts of problems that private military contractors encounter when they turn back, whether it's to do with drugs or alcohol, managing PTSD, and general life skills as well. If you've been socialised into a military culture since you're 17, 18, and you then return back to the UK, often it's difficult to pay your bills, to find somewhere to live, to get a job, and so on. Another interesting finding is actually the next job. How do you get your next job? What do you end up doing? And this is where your former life as a soldier will actually play quite a major role in determining what positions you'll take up. In my research, occupational culture has plays an important role. Certainly, the military creates a very strong occupational culture, and the private military sector reproduces that culture to a significant degree, not completely, but to a significant degree. Because pretty much everyone is former soldier, they very quickly revert back to kind of military style patterns of behaviour and interactions. And actually, that's what they're paid for. I mean, their value on the labour market is that they can respond to emergency situations like a soldier. So actually, to forget about their occupational culture and how they manage risky situations would be problematic, because that's not what they're paid to do. But that also has an interesting implication for their civilian transition, because if you like, the civilian transition as viewed from the military entails taking someone who is heavily kind of embedded within soldiering occupational culture and seeing how they can be transitioned back to civil society in a way that manages kind of common traits of soldiering. Whereas private military contracting, you still have that occupational culture that is very similar to a soldier, but there's no process of managing the transition of that occupational culture back to the UK. And as a consequence, what you find is that you have people acting in a soldier-like way in circumstances that are inappropriate. And I'm sure that happens, that happens to those who never went into private military contracting. But I think the key distinction is that one is more managed than the other. The market doesn't seek to manage that transition. I think it's certainly the case that many veterans find it difficult to present to support workers, organisations, because they've got very much a can-do attitude. They're used to being very self-sufficient, and it can be quite difficult to say, I need help. An interesting dimension is that when a former soldier leaves the armed forces and then puts their hand up for help, there is a lot of support available. And veterans charities have names like Help for Heroes, and they're embraced and they're celebrated and they're helped. There's a real willingness to support them. Now, that is more problematic if you've been a soldier turned private military contractor who's come home, because I think you're seen as being slightly less worthy of support. You took the money. You left the military. You kind of, you took your duty-bound relationship within the state, turned into a contractual relationship in the market. So are you still as worthy? Are you still eligible for support in the same way? Now, in purely technical terms, the answer is yes, you are. You served. And under the eligibility criteria of most charities, that means you're entitled to help. Whether or not you're managed in the same way is a different question. And I think that actually that process starts with the individual themselves. And my data suggests that you're less likely to present if you've been a private military contractor, in part because maybe you don't think that you do deserve the support in the same way as those who never went into the private military sector. Then you get to the charity sector, and if you've got two cases side by side, former soldier just come straight out, former soldier gone into the private military sector, then come out, both got very similar needs, but you've only got the ability to support one or the other. My research would certainly suggest that they would go for the former soldier. And I think a lot of the charities have got a sense as well that, their donors would also want that. They would also want the soldier to be supported over the contractor. So there is a certain set of difficulties that shape the management and access to support. The way in which society often frames private military contractors is mercenaries. And there is a strong anti-mercenary norm that's quite deeply embedded in society, this idea that you can profit from war. Now, certainly, most former private military contractors would not see themselves as mercenaries, and their contracts have been very much in support of coalition objectives. They see themselves as working alongside British Armed Forces, and very much identify the British Armed Forces, and wouldn't countenance the idea of working for whoever pays the most. Yet that doesn't stop society framing their activities through the prism of mercenarism. And once that has happened, that then changes how these individuals are received when they come back home. One of the difficulties in answering the question, where do all the contractors go, is that no one's really keeping tabs on them. They move from company to company, from contract to contract, like any other subcontractor. Once you leave a company, they don't tend to be that bothered about where you've gone. And so it's very difficult to get a sense of employment trajectories. Interestingly, one way I've found that you can do this is to use LinkedIn. Now, because you're in a hostile environment, it's very difficult to network for employment opportunities. Online networking has proven to be a very popular method. And I gained access to a LinkedIn group that had 381 UK private military contractors. And they all worked in the same contract in Iraq as of 2010-11. And then I've looked at where they've ended up in 2015. And what's interesting is about 50-50 split between those who have stayed in hostile environment work, some of which is in Iraq and Afghanistan, but is also further afield in North Africa, elsewhere in the Middle East, and 50% have returned home. Of those that returned home, the clear majority have been working as private security officers, and shown a very clear linkage between the private military labour market and the private security labour market. And in fact, that's increasingly becoming, I think, one big fluid labour market, especially as multinational corporations like G4S or GardaWorld have presence in both labour markets. It becomes more normalised for individuals to shift between them. But also plenty go into other areas of work like telecommunications or project management or other blue light services. And then you get the few outliers who are doing things that essentially have little relationship to military work, be it photography and the like. So I do have some insight into employment trajectories, but that doesn't say anything about their experiences, what physical and psychological condition they're in. It just says they've got a job doing X, Y, Z. Interestingly, very, very few are unemployed, or at least in the data set, very few are unemployed. Maybe that's, of course, to do with the data set. I think another contribution of my research is to rethink the relationship between the professions of policing and soldiering. Now, through a state-centric lens, there seem to be quite separate professions, and indeed states for a long time have tried to keep them separate. And soldiering was one line of employment and had its own set of training requirements and professional standards and code of ethics, and policing was another. Now, there was movement between them for sure, but it wasn't almost instantaneous movement. However, in the global labour market, the professions of policing and soldiering are becoming increasingly blurred. The length of time between working in the private military sector using soldiering skills and the private security sector using policing skills can actually be very, very short. Indeed, you could be, doing convoy protection on Route Irish on the Friday and working the doors in Liverpool in a nightclub the next Friday. And in many ways, what you're doing there is you're taking the professions of policing and soldiering, and you're kind of condensing them in a very short space of time, which has many problems. But I think conceptually, understanding how the global labour market is bringing these professions together and merging them is another important implication of my research. Well, I think my research has important implications for how the veteran is conceptualised. I think there's been an orthodoxy that the veteran is essentially a product of the public sector. They are seen to be former soldiers who have worked in state militaries, who have been paid for through tax contributions. Now, that's simply not the case anymore. Increasingly, veterans come from a variety of locations, and one of the main ones is the private sector. You can be a private military contractor for decades, working alongside soldiers in frontline in Iraq and Afghanistan, elsewhere, and then you come home, and for me, you're still a veteran, but you're not necessarily a veteran in the orthodox sense of being a former veteran of the armed forces. You are a private military veteran. And I think veteran studies more generally needs to broaden out its idea of where veterans can come from. I still think that there's too much focus on veterans as being former state soldiers. Veterans can come from a variety of places, and I think private military veterans are one of the most important categories of non-state veteran. But I think there's a broader research agenda in there as well. I mean, I haven't done research on this, but to illustrate my point, those individuals who are going from the UK to the Middle East to fight with or against ISIS and then potentially coming back are very different. They're very different sorts of veterans. There's plenty of literature now on proxy warfare or ambiguous warfare or hybrid warfare, new wars. Basically, we haven't got wars that are conducted between states who are sending soldiers to bang up against each other for years on end and then going back home. These wars are far more amorphous, and there are various agencies that are involved in the fighting, and that creates a plurality of veterans rather than state-centric veterans. And I think part of what my research, at least I hope, can achieve is to contribute towards the process of pluralising conceptions of veterans and veteranality.